We would like to send out a special thanks to Best Fiends for supporting The Trail Went Cold. Best Fiends is a unique and exciting puzzle experience unlike other puzzle games out there. Best Fiends updates the game monthly with new levels and events so it never gets old. Download free on the Apple App Store or Google Play. Thank you, and enjoy the episode. January 25th, 1977. Lexington, Kentucky. 24-year-old Melanie Flynn leaves her workplace, but fails to show up for an appointment and does not return home. 2 weeks later, Melanie's abandoned car is discovered in an apartment complex parking lot, and her purse is found washed up next to the Kentucky River later that summer. After numerous eyewitnesses claim to have seen Melanie alive in Florida, the police close the investigation, but her family becomes convinced she was murdered. Over the years, rumors circulate that Melanie worked as an undercover informant for the narcotics squad and was killed by corrupt police officers who were involved in drug trafficking, but the actual truth about what happened to her remains unknown. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and we've got a convoluted missing persons case to cover today. The 1977 disappearance of Melanie Flynn. I received a request to cover this case from a listener sometime last year, and while I had never heard of it before, I recently found myself inside a very deep rabbit hole. Melanie Flynn was a young woman who hailed from a prominent family in Lexington, Kentucky, before she vanished without a trace after leaving her workplace one day. After she was reported missing, the lead detective eventually traveled down to Florida, where he claimed to have received confirmation from several witnesses that Melanie was there. This compelled him to close the investigation, but the problem is that he never actually found Melanie or confirmed she was still alive. It wasn't long before Melanie's family began to suspect that the Lexington Police Department might have been complicit in her disappearance, as she supposedly worked as an undercover drug informant for them and was romantically involved with a narcotics agent who would find himself in serious legal trouble years later. In 1989, investigative reporter Sally Denton published a book titled The Bluegrass Conspiracy, An Inside Story of Power, Greed, Drugs, and Murder, which explored a massive scandal involving drug trafficking and police corruption that dominated Lexington during the 1970s and 80s. And since Melanie Flynn just happened to be connected to many of the key figures in this scandal, the details of her disappearance would dominate the opening chapters of the book, though it would only turn out to be the tip of the iceberg in a very complicated story. So on today's episode, we're going to explore whether or not Melanie came to harm at the hands of some powerful people because she knew too much. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now delve into the unsolved disappearance of Melanie Flynn. Our story begins in Lexington, Kentucky in 1977, and our central figure is 24-year-old Melanie D. Flynn, who currently lives with her parents, Bobby and Ella Ritchie Flynn. Bobby previously served 4 years as a Kentucky state senator and now works as an insurance agent, and Melanie is the middle child in their family, as she has a 25-year-old brother named Doug and an 18-year-old brother named Brad. In fact, Doug Flynn has found success as a Major League Baseball player, as he is currently a utility infielder for the Cincinnati Reds, who have just come off winning their second consecutive World Series championship. Melanie has spent much of her early years traveling the country in hopes of becoming a singer, and while her brother was playing with the Reds, she even spent time living in Cincinnati, performing at some of the local nightclubs under her stage name, Melanie O'Hara. However, when her music career failed to take off, Melanie decided to return to Lexington and move back in with her parents, and got a job as a secretary at the home office for the Kentucky High School Athletic Association, located on Cooper Drive. At around 4 p.m. on January the 25th, Bobby Flynn called up Melanie at work and asked if she would bring home a copy of the directory of Kentucky's high school coaches. Following her shift, Melanie had an appointment scheduled with her psychiatrist, but she told her father she would be home in time for the family dinner and bring him what he asked. At around 5 o'clock, Melanie left the office and was seen climbing into her red 1975 Ford Elite before it headed down Cooper Drive and turned right on South Limestone Street. But Melanie never showed up for her appointment with her psychiatrist, who waited for over an hour for her, and she did not return home to join her family for dinner. Since Melanie was known for being a very social person who spent a lot of time staying out late and hanging around Lexington's partying scene, her parents were not initially concerned, but by January the 28th, Melanie had still not resurfaced, and her office called the Flynn residence to ask if she was sick. Melanie had not shown up for work for 3 days, and even though her latest paycheck was waiting for her, she never bothered to pick it up. After finding out that none of Melanie's other friends or acquaintances had heard from her, Bobby finally contacted the Lexington Police Department to officially report her missing. All of Melanie's clothing and personal possessions, including some prescription antihistamine she took to control her allergies, were left behind at her family's residence, and even though she was believed to have only had $12 in cash on her at the time she went missing, she never touched her bank account. Since she was a very social person, Melanie carried around a black book containing the names of over 200 of her friends, which she also left behind. While police would question every one of these friends, they failed to turn up any answers about what happened to her. On the day she disappeared, an eyewitness claimed to have spotted Melanie speaking to someone in a blue van near the intersection of Cooper Drive and South Limestone Street, the last location she was seen when driving away from her office. Later that night, another eyewitness reported seeing Melanie at a local restaurant called Nellie Kelly's, talking to an unidentified man with a pockmarked face and brown hair parted in the middle. At the outset, Melanie's family wondered if she might have disappeared because she was experiencing some sort of amnesia. Ever since childhood, Melanie had a love of horses and had hoped to become a jockey someday, but in 1972, this dream would be derailed when Melanie suffered a serious head injury after falling off a running horse. The accident left her comatose for 4 days, and after waking up, Melanie would remain hospitalized for over 5 months. The injury caused her to lose all sense of taste and smell, and everyone who knew her said that it caused a noticeable change in her personality. Even though she was still only 19 years old, Melanie soon made the surprising decision to elope and get married to a wealthy horse breeder's son. However, within weeks of the wedding, Melanie wound up back in the hospital with another head injury, reportedly because her husband struck her. This caused Melanie to suffer a temporary bout of partial amnesia, but after she recovered, she immediately filed for divorce from her husband. Prior to her disappearance, Melanie's family thought she seemed to be acting more nervous than usual, but given her prior history of head injuries, they wondered if she might have somehow lost her memory and forgotten who she was. Well, on February the 8th, 2 weeks after she was last seen, Melanie's Ford Elite would be discovered by a police officer in the parking lot of an apartment complex located on Hollow Creek Road, about 3 or 4 miles from her family's residence. While Melanie's purse and car keys were missing, her red leather coat was still inside the car, as well as a suitcase containing clothing, which she had packed for a trip she took to Louisville the weekend before she went missing. Melanie had actually lived in the apartment complex several years earlier, but as far as anyone could tell, she did not know any of its current residents, and the area where it was located was known for being a hotspot for drug activity. Melanie would continue to remain missing for the next 4 months, but on June the 20th, John Bizak, the lead detective who had been assigned to the case, made a surprising announcement. He was now closing the investigation because Melanie had been found alive over 800 miles away in Florida. Weeks earlier, Melanie's mother, Ella, had received a phone call from a woman who claimed that her nephew had met a girl named Melanie Flynn in Daytona Beach, so Detective Bizak traveled down there to follow up on the lead. According to Bizak, numerous eyewitnesses told him they had seen a woman matching Melanie's description staying at Daytona Beach's Texas hotel at various points between March and June, and no less than 9 people identified her from a photograph. These witnesses also claimed this woman told them her name was Melanie and that she was from Kentucky, and provided specific details about her jewelry and mannerisms to convince Bizak that they had actually seen Melanie. However, the problem was that Bizak was unable to actually track down this woman and confirm her identity. 2 members of the hotel's band told Bizak that they saw this woman with 2 other female friends, and she told them they were planning to travel to Knoxville, Tennessee, but she was already gone by the time Bizak arrived. In spite of this, Bizak felt the evidence was convincing enough to believe that Melanie was still alive and that she took off voluntarily. Well, needless to say, the Flynn family were not satisfied with this conclusion, because even though it was not uncommon for Melanie to take off on long trips, she always made sure to stay in contact and let them know where she was. In a bizarre twist of fate, it turned out that Melanie's brother, Brad, had taken a vacation to Daytona Beach and stayed at the Texas hotel in April, but he never saw his sister. Indeed, the Flynn's skepticism would increase on August the 13th, when Melanie's purse was discovered near the Kentucky River. After some heavy rainfall in the area caused flooding, the purse washed up onto a boat dock near Camp Nelson in Jessamine County, located approximately 20 miles south of Lexington. The purse contained lipstick, a perfume atomizer, and 2 bottles of prescription pills, one of which was the antihistamines Melanie had been taking for her allergies. The purse would be sent to the FBI for analysis, and they came to the conclusion that it did belong to Melanie. Well, shortly after the discovery of the purse, a Lexington narcotics agent named Bill Canaan publicly revealed that he had once recruited Melanie to work as an informant for the narcotics squad. Years earlier, Canaan had become the first undercover narcotics agent to be employed by the Lexington Police Department, and claimed that in late 1974, Melanie was arrested for marijuana possession. In order to avoid jail time, Melanie agreed to do some undercover work with Canaan, where she would use her social connections to introduce him to members of the local drug scene. While Melanie's work as an informant only lasted 3 months and came to an end in early 1975, Canaan expressed his belief that perhaps the paranoia about being labeled as a quote-unquote snitch might have prompted Melanie to skip town. Well, needless to say, the revelation about Melanie being an informant came as a complete surprise to her family, who actually believed she was involved in a romantic relationship with Canaan. In fact, Canaan was the first police officer Bobby Flynn spoke to when he reported his daughter missing. While Canaan said he would open an investigation, he told Bobby that the last time he saw Melanie, she had been drinking heavily and taking pills, so he hinted at the possibility that she ran off voluntarily. A number of Melanie's friends were also under the impression that she was dating Canaan, as she had apparently expressed her desire to marry him, and had even been seen introducing Canaan as her boyfriend at parties. However, Canaan was already married to another woman, and denied being in a relationship with Melanie, claiming that they had only pretended to be boyfriend and girlfriend during the time period she was working as an undercover informant. There were also rumors about Melanie and another member of the Lexington narcotics squad named Drew Thornton, who was one of Canaan's closest friends, and resigned from the police department only 2 weeks before Melanie went missing. It was alleged that Melanie had gone out on a few dates with Thornton, but he denied this, and maintained that he and Melanie were nothing more than friends. During their time on the narcotics squad, it seemed like Canaan and Thornton had a high arrest rate, but very few actual convictions. There was suspicion that the two men were taking a lot of the drugs they confiscated and selling them at a profit, but we'll talk more about that in a little while. In 1979, Canaan received a disciplinary hearing in front of the Lexington Fayette Urban City Council and was fired from the narcotics squad for insubordination, inefficiency, and publicly leveling charges of corruption in the police department. Canaan spent the next decade challenging the dismissal and trying to get himself reinstated until his case eventually reached the Kentucky Supreme Court, who upheld the original decision. Anyway, since the Flynns had become distrustful of the Lexington Police Department, they decided to approach Ralph Ross, the head of the Organized Crime and Intelligence Units on the Kentucky State Police, and asked him to reopen the investigation into Melanie's case. For years, Ross had been investigating allegations of corruption and drug activity within the Lexington PD, so he enlisted the help of an FBI agent who traveled to Florida to re-interview many of the same witnesses who claimed to have encountered Melanie there, and the agent ultimately reached the conclusion that the woman they had seen was not her. Over the years, Ross would hear rumors that Bill Canaan and Drew Thornton were involved in Melanie's disappearance, and at one point, graffiti which read, "Bill Canaan killed Melanie Flynn," was spray-painted on a wall near the University of Kentucky campus. In 1982, Ross wound up losing his job with the Kentucky State Police after performing what was deemed to be an illegal wiretap. However, over the course of the next decade, Ross would work closely with a Lexington investigative reporter named Sally Denton, who published a book titled The Bluegrass Conspiracy, An Inside Story of Power, Greed, Drugs, and Murder in 1989. The book highlighted the rampant corruption which took place in Kentucky during that time period, as following his resignation from the Lexington PD, Drew Thornton became the head of the Company, a multi-million-dollar drug smuggling ring. Thornton and his associates would personally fly large quantities of cocaine and marijuana from Colombia into the United States, but it eventually led to Thornton suffering one of the most bizarre deaths ever. During the early morning hours of September the 11th, 1985, Thornton was using his Cessna 404 to fly a large shipment of 40 plastic containers of cocaine he had picked up from Colombia into the U.S. when he realized he was being tracked by federal agents. So Thornton decided to put the plane on autopilot and dumped most of his shipment into Georgia's Chattahoochee National Forest before he parachuted out. The plane would eventually crash in a forest in North Carolina, but unfortunately for Thornton, his chute didn't open properly, and he wound up taking a fatal freefall into the driveway of a private residence in Knoxville, Tennessee. When his body was found, Thornton had a duffel bag strapped to his body, which contained nearly 80 pounds and $15 million worth of cocaine. And while this part of the story has nothing to do with Melanie Flynn's case, I feel obliged to mention that a 175-pound black bear came across the cocaine shipment Thornton had dropped in Chattahoochee National Forest and decided to, shall we say, sample the product. As a result, the bear suffered a fatal overdose, and his dead body would be stuffed by a taxidermist, and he is currently on display at Lexington's Kentucky Fun Mall, having earned the nickname Pablo Escobar. And I almost feel like I should bring an end to this podcast right now, because I'm not sure I'll ever be able to top that story. But I digress. The Bluegrass Conspiracy book spent a couple of chapters focusing on Melanie Flynn's disappearance and her possible connections to the company, and the case would go back into the spotlight in April of 1993, when Bill Canaan was arrested on a series of federal charges, including possession of cocaine with the intent to sell, intimidating witnesses, carrying a fake badge to identify himself as a federal drug officer, and other various firearms charges. At Canaan's federal detention hearing, a former Lexington police officer named George Umstead, who was serving a 36-month sentence on a federal drug conviction, testified that in 1984, Drew Thornton had told him that Canaan had killed Melanie Flynn because he, quote-unquote, loved her. Umstead also claimed that following the publication of the Bluegrass Conspiracy, he personally asked Canaan if he had killed Melanie, and Canaan just sort of smiled, shook his head, and nodded as if to say yes. The hearing would also feature testimony from an FBI agent who described his interactions with a woman named Bonnie Kelly, who was currently serving a life sentence for the murder of Florida State Attorney Eugene Berry, who had been investigating the company. According to the FBI agent, Kelly had once told them that she overheard a conversation between Canaan and Thornton in which they referenced Melanie's disappearance and stated that they would, quote-unquote, never find her. The day after the hearing, the current Lexington police chief, Larry Walsh, appeared as a guest on a local morning radio show and stated they were working on Melanie's case. But everyone was taken by complete surprise when Melanie's mother, Ella Richie Flynn, made an unexpected phone call into the show and spoke live on the air, marking the first time she had spoken publicly about her daughter's case in 16 years. Ella said that her family had done their own independent investigation into Melanie's disappearance and gave the records about the information they obtained to John Bizak, the original lead detective who had since been promoted to captain. Ella complained that the Lexington PD never did anything with this information and later told her the records had been stolen. She found it surprising that Chief Walsh had publicly stated they were still working on the case, since the department had not made any attempt to contact the Flynn family in years. Around the same time period, Ralph Ross also appeared on a local TV show to express his belief that the investigation into Melanie's disappearance was undermined by fears of Bill Canaan and Andrew Thornton. In the end, Canaan was indicted by a grand jury and convicted of the charges at his trial, where he wound up receiving a sentence of 17 years and 8 months in federal prison before he was paroled in September of 2008. In July of 2019, the case made the news again when the Lexington PD announced that they were performing a new search for Melanie's remains by doing an excavation of a former campground called Murphy's Landing, located in Mercer County along the Kentucky River. The dig was set in motion when the authorities received information from an elderly person who lived in another state. While this person's name has never been disclosed publicly, he was described as being a key figure who specifically mentioned a septic hole. This information would be corroborated when the Kentucky State Police received a tip from another unnamed elderly man who was on his deathbed, and he also reportedly mentioned a septic hole. Police did find a septic tank on the property, but after draining its contents, they found nothing, and it could not even be established if the septic tank had been in operation during the time period Melanie went missing. Ultimately, no evidence was found during the excavation, but it prompted investigators to re-interview Bill Canaan, who continued to deny any involvement in Melanie's disappearance. Lexington Police Lieutenant Albert Johnson would even state, quote, "We left the interview believing that he did not know the location of her body," end quote. Earlier this year, on March the 11th, 2020, Canaan passed away at the age of 74, so after more than 4 decades, there are still no conclusive answers about what actually happened to Melanie Flynn. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. But before we continue, we would like to take a moment to thank our sponsor, Best Fiends. When you finish binging the latest riveting podcast on your list, there's always one lingering question staring you in the face. Now what? Sure, you could deep dive down the Wikipedia wormhole researching everything related to the show. Honestly, has anyone not done this? I mean, that's exactly what I do when I prepare all of my episodes. But when your brain or your browser tabs are full, that's when it might be time to take a load off. So I like to take that opportunity to clear a few levels on Best Fiends, which can best be described as boredom's worst nightmare. We all love a good challenge, and Best Fiends gives you over 5,000 of them. Since more levels, events, and challenges are added all the time, you don't have to choose between binging and boredom. In fact, you might find yourself wondering how you ever found the time for a dull moment before. Since my podcast exclusively covers unsolved mysteries it often feels like I spend a great deal of time trying to put together a massive jigsaw puzzle, but Best Fiends allows me to de-stress with puzzles, which are a lot more fun. As of this recording, I'm creeping up on level 900, and I always get a rush of adrenaline whenever I beat any of these levels. So download Best Fiends free today from the Apple App Store or Google Play. That's friends without the R, Best Fiends. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of our episode. So one of the biggest challenges with putting together this episode is that the disappearance of Melanie Flynn was ultimately just the tip of the iceberg in the mammoth true crime story known as the Bluegrass Conspiracy. I've already made multiple references to the book by Sally Denton, and she pretty much uses Melanie's disappearance as the opening hook during her first few chapters before it starts delving into the massive conspiracies involving the drug smuggling organization known as the Company. Since a lot of this activity took place years after Melanie went missing, I don't want to get too bogged down in this material, because you could probably do a long-form, multi-episode podcast to share the entire story of the Bluegrass Conspiracy. But it's definitely relevant to Melanie's case, since she was known to be associated with a number of shady characters who became involved in this conspiracy, and one of the most prominent theories is that she was murdered because she knew too much. So here's a brief summary of how the Company worked. Drew Thornton was definitely the mastermind, but his closest partner was Bradley Bryant, a longtime friend of his whom he had known since they served together in the military. The other key figure was Henry Vance, another friend of Thornton's, who had once worked with him on the Lexington Police Department's narcotics squad, but while working for the Fayette County Sheriff's Office, Vance lost his job after he forged the sheriff's name on a purchase order for 24 .44 Magnum revolvers. In spite of this, Vance wound up getting a job with the Kentucky State Legislature and even worked on the staff for Governor John Y. Brown, Jr. Because he had a job on the inside, Vance's key role was obtaining information about law enforcement's investigation into the Company and feeding it to Thornton, for which he received a large cut of the profits. I've previously mentioned how Thornton was killed after a fatal freefall out of his airplane, but Bradley Bryant's drug smuggling career came to an end in 1981 when he was arrested for attempting to sell a large quantity of marijuana to some undercover DEA agents, for which he received a 15-year prison sentence. As for Henry Vance, you might recall me mentioning that Ralph Ross, whom the Flynn family had asked to reopen Melanie's case, wound up losing his job with the Kentucky State Police after setting up an illegal wiretap on someone, and that just happened to be Henry Vance. You also might remember me briefly mentioning a woman named Bonnie Kelly, who is currently serving a life sentence for the murder of a Florida state attorney named Eugene Berry. What happened is that Kelly's husband had recently been arrested, and since he was involved with the Company, Vance was fearful he was going to make a deal and share everything he knew with the authorities, so he hired Bonnie Kelly to assassinate Berry before this could happen. For his role in the crime, Vance received a 15-year prison sentence for conspiracy to commit murder, though he would be released after serving less than 9 of those years for good behavior. But here's an interesting piece of poetic justice. I mentioned that Bill Cannan died earlier this year on March the 11th, 2020, but Henry Vance also wound up passing away only 3 days later on March the 14th at the age of 77. Of course, the downside is that if either one of them had knowledge about what happened to Melanie, they both took that info to their graves. Anyway, if you want to get an idea of what the Company was like, I'd recommend watching the 2017 movie American Made, which starred Tom Cruise as Barry Seal, a pilot who, much like Drew Thornton, flew a large quantity of drugs from Colombia into the United States. It's a completely separate story, but this should give you an idea of how rampant these drug smuggling operations were during this time period. If you want more information about this topic, I'd recommend reading The Bluegrass Conspiracy, but for now, I'm going to put the rest of this episode's focus on Melanie Flynn. Melanie was definitely an interesting individual, and even though it sounds like she could lead a pretty wild, partying lifestyle at times, which you'd think would prove problematic when you're the daughter of a former state senator, it sounds like she always remained very close to her family and had no issues living with her parents at age 24. At the time she went missing, Melanie was still holding down a respectable job as a secretary, so I think her parents held the attitude that she was a grown adult who was free to live her life how she wanted. This probably explains why they were not overly concerned during the first few days she was missing, even though Melanie had failed to show up as promised for a family dinner. And as a devout baseball fan, I was quite fascinated to learn that Melanie's brother, Doug Flynn, was a player on the best team in the major leagues at that time. During the 1970s, the Cincinnati Reds were nicknamed the Big Red Machine and had so much talent on their team that you can understand why Doug spent most of his time on the bench as a backup utility infielder. But hey, he got to be on the roster when they won 2 consecutive World Series championships. Doug was interviewed about his sister's case in newspaper articles in 1977, but you can tell that the ordeal had a negative effect on him, as he did not play well, and in June of that year, he was one of 4 players traded from the Reds to the New York Mets for one of the greatest pitchers of all time, Tom Seaver. However, Doug's play with the Mets did improve, and he wound up winning a Gold Glove Award for his outstanding play at second base during the 1980 season. Doug retired in 1985 after appearing in 1,308 Major League games, and during the last decade, he has also worked part-time as a radio and television broadcaster with the Cincinnati Reds. But as much as I'd like to keep talking about baseball, this is a true crime podcast, so let's start talking about Melanie again. While there have been reports that Melanie seemed more nervous than usual prior to her disappearance, nothing seemed out of the ordinary on the actual day she went missing. Melanie told her parents that she was planning to join them at home for dinner after seeing her psychiatrist, but since she never showed up for her appointment, it's obvious that something happened shortly after she drove away from her workplace. We do have a couple of other eyewitness sightings of Melanie later that day, which include her speaking with someone in a blue van at the intersection just down the street from her office, as well as her being seen with an unidentified man at a restaurant that night. I'm willing to chalk up the restaurant sighting to mistaken identity, but if the sighting of her with the blue van is accurate, I would be interested to know if the driver compelled her to pull over and speak to them, which is what ultimately paved the way for her disappearance. From what I've heard, the one consistency with Melanie is that she had a particularly close relationship with her mother, so it would have been very out of character for her to not show up for a family dinner without at least calling. Yes, Melanie did have a wild side and would often take off and travel across the country, but throughout everything, she would always make sure to phone her mother to let her know where she was. This is why, even though there would be reported sightings to suggest that Melanie traveled down to Florida, her family did not believe she would have done so without contacting them. Indeed, even if those sightings were accurate, it's unclear how Melanie would have made the trip to Florida to begin with, since her abandoned car was found in the parking lot of an apartment complex in a rather rough part of Lexington. Since some of the witnesses in Daytona Beach reported seeing Melanie in the company of some female friends, then yes, theoretically, she could have gotten a ride with someone. But the detail which does not make sense is that Melanie's leather jacket was left behind in her vehicle, even though the weather in Lexington was incredibly cold at the time she went missing. She also left behind a pre-packed suitcase of clothes in her car, as well as all of her personal possessions at home, and since she never touched her bank account, it's never been explained how she managed to travel to Daytona Beach and spend 3 months in a hotel with nothing more than $12 in her pocket. I do find it curious how Melanie's car was left at an apartment complex which Melanie had lived in years earlier but had no real connection to by this time. This is a bit reminiscent of an episode I released last year about the unsolved 2007 disappearance of Joey Lynn Offit, whose abandoned car was also found in the parking lot of an apartment complex where she had lived years earlier. In both these cases, you get the impression that the car may have been planted at the respective locations by someone who had knowledge of the victim's past and wanted to give off the false impression that the victim parked the vehicle there themselves. The eventual discovery of Melanie's purse in the Kentucky River makes it even more difficult to believe she took off voluntarily. It makes no sense for her to throw away the antihistamine she was taking. So I definitely believe that the entire investigation into the Daytona Beach sightings was pretty troubling. According to the lead detective, John Bizak, he spoke with no less than 9 eyewitnesses who positively identified Melanie from her photograph, and their various timelines suggested that she had been staying at the same hotel down there for 3 months. These witnesses also apparently provided specific details about Melanie to suggest they really interacted with her and had not mistaken her for another woman, so Bizak came to the conclusion that Melanie took off voluntarily and was still alive, which is why he decided to close the investigation. But the big issue is that he did not actually confirm with 100% certainty that she was still alive. Yes, there are other documented cases where missing people do disappear of their own accord, and after they're found, they will sometimes tell law enforcement that they have no desire to reconnect with their family, and if they're a legal adult, it's their right to make this decision. Whenever this happens, law enforcement will often respect the missing person's privacy by not disclosing the location they were found, only confirming to the public that they are still alive and the case is now closed. However, before they do this, they will make actual contact with the missing individual and verify their identity, but this is not what Detective Bizak did, as he just seemed to take other people's word that Melanie was still alive, but did not actually track her down himself to confirm this. I mean, I know that missing persons investigations were handled much differently during the 1970s, and they have come a long way since then, but this sounds ridiculously irresponsible. At best, Bizak was not performing due diligence, but at worst, he could have made the decision to close the investigation due to internal pressure from the Lexington PD. Unlike many of the other law enforcement figures in this story, it doesn't sound like Bizak was ever implicated in any serious scandals, as he had a pretty successful career, publishing a number of police manuals and serving as commissioner of the Kentucky Department of Criminal Justice Training following his retirement from the force. But after he was promoted to captain, Bizak would face heavy criticism from Melanie's mother, Ella Ritchie Flynn, after she supposedly provided him with some records to assist the department with the investigation, and they were mysteriously stolen under his watch. So whatever successes Bizak might have achieved in his police career, working on Melanie's case was not one of them. So now I think it would be an appropriate time to talk about another colorful character in this story who has a Florida connection. After Melanie's short-lived marriage came to an end, she hooked up with a wealthy Cuban-born horse breeder named Mario Crespo, who ran a prominent horse farm in Lexington and was involved in producing B-movies. Crespo also reportedly ran an escort service in which he would videotape his women in compromising positions with state government officials for extortion and blackmail purposes. Melanie often traveled with Crespo and worked a few jobs for him, such as appearing as a model at some of his horse events, but it was never officially confirmed if they were romantically involved, and Melanie always maintained that their relationship was purely professional. Crespo did have connections with the Lexington PD, as Drew Thornton and other off-duty police officers would sometimes moonlight by providing security for his horse farm. Around the time Melanie went missing, Crespo and 6 other women traveled down to Florida to film some commercials, and while Melanie was apparently supposed to join them at some point, she never showed up. I'm not saying that Crespo had any involvement in Melanie's disappearance, but it is interesting how she was apparently planning to take a trip to Florida at some point So if you believe the eyewitness sightings of her at the Texas hotel are accurate, then perhaps she went there because she was scheduled to do some work with Crespo. I mean, if the rumors are true that Crespo used his women to blackmail powerful figures, and Melanie became involved in that, there's a potential motive for why she was made to disappear. But again, it really doesn't make much sense for Melanie to abandon her car in a rough neighborhood and toss her purse into a river if she was planning to leave the state. It seems like this whole lead with Florida started because Melanie's mother received a tip from a woman who claimed her nephew had seen Melanie in Daytona Beach. So if the Lexington PD had a vested interest in giving off the false impression that Melanie was still alive somewhere, then they could have twisted the facts about these eyewitness sightings in order to fit their narrative. But before I start talking about potential foul play scenarios, I do have to acknowledge it's not completely impossible that Melanie's disappearance could have been the result of some sort of mental breakdown. After all, she did suffer a very serious head injury after the horse riding accident years earlier, and while this did not prevent Melanie from living a fully functional life, it does sound like this injury changed her personality. At the outset, her family even leaned towards the theory that Melanie had lost her memory, as she did once go through a bout of partial amnesia, reportedly because her ex-husband struck her and exasperated her head injury. If something happened to Melanie shortly after she left her workplace, which somehow triggered this again, then yes, I suppose she could have developed amnesia and wandered off. This could provide a potential explanation for why her car was parked at her former apartment complex, as she could have forgotten her identity, but still had vague memories of having lived there years earlier. Maybe the reason her purse was found in the Kentucky River was because she leaped in there herself, and they've just never found her body. All that being said, I don't believe this scenario is very likely, and given the amount of shady characters Melanie seemed to hang around with, I am inclined to believe she got herself mixed up in something which led to her becoming the victim of foul play. By the sound of things, the first time the Flynn family started becoming really suspicious of the Lexington PD was when Bill Canaan publicly stated that Melanie had once worked as an undercover informant for the narcotics squad. Up until this point, they just assumed she was romantically involved with Canaan and were taken by surprise when he totally downplayed their relationship. Remember, when Bobby Flynn officially reported Melanie missing, the first cop he spoke to was Canaan, who was quick to imply that Melanie had a problem with drugs and alcohol and seemed to want to quell Bobby's expectations that he would ever see her again. It sounds like Canaan was trying to plant the seeds in her family's heads that she took off on her own, and since they believed he had a close relationship with Melanie, they were surprised by how concerned Canaan seemed to be when she was missing. I find it very interesting that Canaan went public with the information about Melanie being a drug informant immediately after her purse was found near the Kentucky River. Before this, the Lexington PD had essentially closed the investigation because they were certain Melanie was alive in Florida, but now that evidence was found to contradict this idea, Canaan started pushing forward the idea that Melanie ran away because she was facing heat over being an informant. But that doesn't make much sense, because by Canaan's own admission, Melanie had not done any undercover work for around 2 years. A few weeks after Canaan made this announcement, Doug Flynn did an interview in the newspapers in which he publicly expressed his skepticism about Canaan's claims. As far as Doug knew, Melanie did feed Canaan tips from time to time because she was an active socialite who was friends with a number of people and wanted to help Canaan out because she was dating him. But Doug did not believe that Melanie ever worked for the police in an official capacity. Indeed, from what I read, they never found any official documentation, such as court records or police expense reports, to verify the claims that Melanie was an informant. From what I've read about Canaan, since he was the first person to ever work as an undercover narcotics agent with the Lexington PD, he was pretty much given free rein to do whatever he wanted, under the guise of maintaining his quote-unquote cover. So this probably explains why he and other narcotics agents like Drew Thornton were able to get away with selling off the drugs they seized at a profit. It seems plausible that after Canaan became romantically involved with Melanie, he used her social connections to meet prominent figures on the drug scene, which would help him expand his own drug dealing operations. After all, when Melanie went missing, she left behind a black book containing the names of over 200 friends, so she definitely knew a lot of people. So now I want to discuss one more colorful figure in this whole saga, a prominent, wealthy Lexington socialite named Anita Madden, who was known as the Bluegrass Baroness. Both Anita and her husband, Preston Madden, lived at a 2,000-acre horse farm called Hamburg Place, which was the home to a number of prize thoroughbreds, many of which won races like the Kentucky Derby and the Belmont Stakes. The couple was known for hosting lavish parties at Hamburg Place, and every year before the Kentucky Derby, it became a tradition for them to host the annual Madden Derby Party, which was often attended by famous celebrities and some of the area's wealthiest citizens. Melanie was reportedly close friends with Anita and attended her parties, which may have paved the way for introducing Bill Canaan into their inner circle. It's been rumored that the Maddens' parties often got pretty wild, and that Drew Thornton and the company helped supply them and their wealthy guests with a lot of cocaine during the late 1970s and early 80s. But while a number of people maintained that Melanie and Anita were friends, Anita completely downplayed the relationship following Melanie's disappearance, claiming that she barely knew her and not cooperating very much with investigators. According to Sally Denton, when she first started reporting on this story, Anita picketed the television station where Denton worked and demanded that she be fired for spreading false information. Anyway, Anita passed away in 2018, and in another odd twist of fate, her husband Preston Madden died on May the 5th, 2020, less than 2 months after the deaths of Bill Canaan and Henry Vance. It definitely sounds like Canaan and Drew Thornton may have used Melanie to help them expand their operations involving drugs, though there are still conflicting reports about whether Melanie was romantically involved with Thornton. I do find it to be interesting timing that Melanie's disappearance took place only 2 weeks after Thornton resigned from the Lexington PD. One of the most prominent theories in this case is that Thornton or Canaan, or both of them, found out that Melanie had been openly talking about their illegal activities, and since they believed she knew too much and was a liability, they ultimately decided to murder her. But it's also possible that the crime was more personal, as another theory which was pushed around is that Canaan got rid of Melanie because she threatened to expose their affair to his wife. When Canaan was indicted on federal drug charges in 1993, a couple of witnesses testified that they heard Canaan and Thornton imply that they were responsible for killing Melanie, but this was technically nothing more than hearsay evidence. You can't really charge a guy with murder just because someone else said he smiled and kind of nodded when they asked him if he did it. It sounds like the most promising lead during the past 4 decades has been the dig which took place to search for Melanie's remains last summer at Murphy's Landing. I find it very intriguing that 2 completely separate eyewitnesses advised police to dig at that location, and they both specifically mentioned a septic hole. And this is definitely not the first time anyone has named Murphy's Landing as a possible burial location. In 2012, a local news station produced a segment about this case with Melanie's younger brother, Brad, and it featured him taking a trip to Murphy's Landing, as he claimed that multiple people have mentioned this spot to him over the years. Brad even pointed towards a cave he searched through that contained a large hole covered by a heavy metal plate which he was unable to move, but it's unclear if the authorities have ever made any additional attempts to search in there. Murphy's Landing is also located next to the Kentucky River, and it sounds like it's not too far from the location where Melanie's purse was found, so you have to think this area has some significance. While the police have never disclosed the identities of the 2 elderly individuals who provided them with the information which compelled them to perform this excavation, They did mention that one of them was on their deathbed at that time, and Bill Canaan, Henry Vance, and Preston Madden, 3 individuals who may have had knowledge about what happened, all passed away in close proximity to each other during the first half of 2020. It was also confirmed that Canaan was re-interviewed by investigators, and I am intrigued by their choice of words. Quote, "We left the interview believing that he did not know the location of her body." End quote. Now, that might not necessarily mean they believe Canaan is innocent. He may very well have been complicit or had full knowledge about what happened to Melanie, but if someone else was responsible for the disposal of her body, Canaan may legitimately not know where it is. If Melanie was killed because she knew too much, then how exactly would these events have played out? It really did not appear there was anything out of the ordinary on the day Melanie went missing, as she was heading to an appointment with her psychiatrist and told her family she was planning to join them for dinner, but something obviously happened after she left her office. I think this case might hinge on the accuracy of the sighting of Melanie talking to someone in a blue van. Did this person compel Melanie to stop and pull over? Since her car was ultimately found at another location, did the person in the van convince Melanie to drive somewhere where she was subsequently set up and killed? I would be curious to know if there was anyone from Melanie's life, such as Canaan or Thornton, who could be linked to a blue van during that time period. I have heard rumors that what happened to Melanie may have been an open secret among many people, including members of the Lexington PD, but no one wanted to talk. And what adds to the tragedy is that it seems like fewer and fewer people who might know the truth about Melanie's disappearance are still with us. Even if the 2 men who provided the tips about Murphy's Landing last year are telling the truth, the passage of time and the loss of memories may make it difficult to find the exact location where Melanie's remains are buried. However, over the years, it's been said countless times that all it might take to crack this case is for the right person to come forward, and there might still be people out there who have the necessary information to lead to a resolution. So if you happen to know anything about the unsolved disappearance of Melanie Flynn, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now, the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. We produced a bunch of exclusive bonus episodes for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3, and this past month, I released an episode in which I discussed and analyzed the famous Unsolved Mysteries Halloween special, which aired on television in October of 1988, and featured 4 very memorable segments about ghosts. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've also recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon these past few weeks, and they are Ben W., Abra G., Jake H., Ashley M., Michelle, Lindsay L., Andrea J., Tristan A., Megan C., J.L. Draw, Jody P., and Jennifer M. Thank you so much for your support. In addition, I also wanted to provide another reminder that I hold live streaming sessions on a platform called Get Vocal. Every Thursday night from 7 until 8 p.m. Eastern Time, I host what is essentially an after show for each week's podcast episode, where I have an interactive discussion about the featured case from said episode and answer questions and address comments from listeners. I always include a link to these sessions in our show notes of every episode, so be sure to check there for more information or visit getvocal.com. That's GETVOKL.com. I also just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, or Spotify. So have yourself a good week and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.